So in the Department of Human Dimensions, and she and Andrew are going to cover all the human dimensions information that we have. So Tara.
Well, I just want to say thank you so much to Marianne and to Stuart for organizing this and having us involved. And also I have to say, thanks to both of them and to the partners for allowing us to be involved in this overall study. It's been an extremely rewarding project, and we've had the opportunity to be involved in a variety of different aspects of it. In the Department of Human Dimensions of Natural Resources at Colorado State University, we're really passionate about being able to make a difference in conservation and natural resources, so we have a very applied focus in a lot of our projects, and this study is definitely one example of that. So we're really appreciative of the opportunity. So I'm going to talk big picture today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the overall problem of human-wildlife conflict, which obviously human-coyote conflict is a part of. And then I'm also going to talk a little bit about the role of human dimensions information in that context. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the definitions for human dimensions of natural resources, realizing that not everybody is fully familiar with what that term or what that field entails. And then that will set the stage for being able to turn it over to Andrew Don Carlos, who will talk to you about the results of the human dimensions component of the coyote study here in the Denver metro area. So these are all challenges that are contributing to things like loss of biodiversity, habitat loss and fragmentation, and of course an acceleration of human-wildlife conflict in many areas. So some of you might be trying to figure out what these pictures are displaying. In the upper left corner we have elk in the western slope of Colorado in a residential area, sort of depicting that coexistence that we're seeing more and more now in urban environments. Here there's a moose in amongst a series of what we would call combat anglers who are sort of fighting over the fishing opportunity at the height of the salmon run on the Kenai River in Alaska. So obviously another example of a human-wildlife conflict situation that could involve some safety threats. And then of course here we have a coyote involved in depredation on livestock, a perfect example of some of the human-wildlife conflict incidents that we're seeing increase in a variety of areas. So here's a broad definition for human-wildlife conflict. The definition actually comes to us from the IUCN World Parks Congress recommendation. In 2003, at the World Parks Congress, and this only happens every 10 years, they came up with a global recommendation about the need to address human-wildlife conflict because of the severity of this global problem and its consequences for wildlife populations and human livelihoods around the world. So studies from around the world show evidence of the severity of the conflict, and they also talk about a lot of the drivers of this phenomenon being human-caused. So these would be things like individual human behaviors, but also broader human factors or broader social factors like urbanization and land use changes and so on. But they define it as occurring when the needs and behavior of wildlife impact negatively on the goals of humans, or when the goals of humans negatively impact the needs of wildlife. So recognizing that it's a two-way street, and this can involve some of the direct incidents that we think about, human attacks, but it can also involve more indirect incidents. Here's a broad spectrum of human-wildlife conflict scenarios. So we see the range here from the least severe to the more extreme circumstances. So nuisance encounters, crop and residential damage, predation on livestock and pets, zoonoses, kind of in the middle there, auto and airplane collisions, and then of course attacks on humans. And this is sort of a traditional model for looking at the different types of human-wildlife conflict. There are certainly other things that we can include in this, which actually brings me to the next slide. So increasingly now when we talk about human-wildlife conflict, we're talking about human-human conflict over wildlife issues being a part of this. So different stakeholders with different preferences for management, different views of the resource, and different relationships or interactions with the resource. So this rise in social conflict is important to talk about in the context of human-wildlife conflict broadly. And this rise in social conflict we see increasingly defining the context of wildlife conservation efforts, and this is globally as well as more locally, but also it conveys what we're up against in terms of success of management strategies or success of mitigation strategies, which are oftentimes dependent upon public support. So as part of this, we're seeing emerging public interests with different preferences. We see evidence of that if you look at the National Survey on Fishing, Hunting, and Wildlife-Associated Recreation. It's shown over the years pretty dramatic declines in hunting participation nationally and at the state level, and then growth in interest in other forms of recreation like wildlife viewing. Now this poses some challenges, particularly as we think about the state wildlife agencies, because on the one hand, hunting is something that's largely responsible for a lot of the revenue. So agencies are very dependent upon the sale of hunting and fishing licenses to support a lot of the wildlife conservation revenue. And then also there are concerns about competition among different stakeholders over a limited resource on our public lands. And then of course in some areas you're talking about the loss of a population control mechanism with declines in hunting too for ungulate populations. So a lot of challenges kind of interwoven in there. Increasingly over the years too, we've seen a public that wants to be more actively involved in wildlife decisions, and we see evidence of this in the rise in ballot initiatives over the years, and also the rise in concerns about ethical treatment of animals. So this is all part of that rise in social conflict that we're seeing play out. This is another example of the challenges that we like to talk about in the context of human-wildlife conflict. So with urbanization, increasingly we see a public that's more removed from direct day-to-day interaction with wildlife. And what that sometimes means is a public that's less educated about what constitutes appropriate behavior for interacting with wildlife. And at the same time, our research shows that we've got a segment of the public that's emerging that wants to have these more intimate and up-close experiences with wildlife. So there's a trade-off there. I mean, this is actually, some of you may have seen this before, this is a billboard that you see on the way to Yellowstone that's advertising a certain kind of tourist opportunity in a captive facility. And people are wanting these kinds of opportunities, but there are concerns about the message that may be displaying in terms of safety concerns. So all of this, just sets the stage for thinking about the importance of some of these social factors that are really contributing to a root of a lot of the challenges, including human-wildlife conflict, that we're faced with in wildlife management. So you could argue that response to these challenges and development of effective mitigation strategies demands integrated approaches that can account for some of the social influences, which would be people's needs and interests and the nature of their relationship with wildlife at the root of that. We know that human thoughts and behaviors ultimately, oftentimes, determine the course and resolution of the conflict, so that really speaks to the importance of understanding those underlying factors. And also, as Madden and others have pointed out in recent publications, there's a need for greater in-depth analysis of a lot of the causes, which, as I've depicted here, are oftentimes social in nature, but there's a need to explore that more readily. So that brings us to talking about the field of human dimensions of conservation, or human dimensions of natural resources. And this is where we can glean some insight into what are some of these social factors that are playing a role in driving the acceleration of human-wildlife conflict, and how might we use information from this field and this scientific research to inform future solutions. And so broadly, this field is about obtaining information about people, society, and culture, and using it in making decisions about conservation. What I like about that definition is it is fairly broad, and it's pretty easy to get your head around. For years when I started working in this field, I found it really difficult to convey to people outside of human dimensions who had never heard of it before what it is I do. And my background originally was in wildlife biology, and then my PhD was in the human dimensions realm, actually drawing upon the field of social psychology. So I've sort of merged those two areas, but it's definitely something difficult for people to to understand the first time they're exposed to it. So we need some of these generic definitions that can help with that. More specifically, here are a couple other definitions that I'll share with you that I tend to like for defining this field. Another kind of general one at the top there, it's a science aimed at understanding the social aspects of natural resource management, okay? And a lot of times what we're doing is drawing from the social sciences and then applying those concepts and methodologies to natural resource topics. So that's really what that first one kind of captures there. A definition that our Human Dimensions of Natural Resources Department had come up with, for sort of defining the scope of our work. It's an area of investigation that attempts to describe, predict, understand, and in some cases affect human thought and action toward natural environments. I will say that that definition draws largely from the realm of social psychology that a lot of us have been trained in, so the focus is very much on individual thought and behavior. Other social sciences, like say anthropology or political science, might have a different perspective on the kinds of things that you're studying in there. And then the final one, this actually came from Colorado Division of Wildlife, before the name change to Colorado Parks and Wildlife, when they had a human dimensions unit that worked very closely with Colorado State University. And their initial sort of defining definition for that unit was identifying what people think and do regarding wildlife management and understanding why. So that's just applied more to the wildlife context, and it kind of takes elements of that definition right above it and applies it sort of more generically. So just real briefly, to expose you to a little bit of history here in terms of how human dimensions really came about as its own field of investigation. There are two separate traditions that we can talk about in terms of how this evolved in this country, in the United States, but also more globally. So the first one, Human Dimensions of Natural Resources, as it's oftentimes labeled, had an early recreation focus, and it came largely out of the field of natural resource management here in the US. So the tipping point for a lot of this that they trace back to is following World War II. After World War II, there was a huge growth in our economy, and as one of the sort of outcomes of that, we had a huge increase in participation in outdoor recreation on our public lands. So you had a lot more people getting out and recreating, and this started to raise concerns on the part of natural resource managers about the potential impacts that could be having on the natural environment. And so a lot of that early work in Human Dimensions, as it evolved at that time, was focused on understanding outdoor recreation participation trends and the impacts associated with that. And then an entire field started to evolve, and over time, researchers became more and more interested in things like how do we define a quality recreation experience? How do we define user satisfaction? And then the shift became away from just recreation towards something much broader, and that's really where we are today with that particular tradition. Now the other one, you'll see it oftentimes referred to as conservation social science or social science and conservation. And this is something that evolved not so much out of the natural resource management tradition here in this country, but more out of the social sciences themselves. So for example, in anthropology and psychology and political science, increasingly over the years you've had researchers that focus more attention on environmental and conservation topics because that's of interest and because they want to have an application in that area. And in fact, there was a review piece that was written by an anthropologist by the name of Paul Little a decade or so ago that talked about this new millennium of research on environmental topics in anthropology, just as one illustration. And the focus oftentimes in this realm is on understanding some of the broader linkages between human conditions, human livelihoods, and conservation topics. What we're seeing now, increasingly globally, is that these two traditions are starting to merge and come together. And so the hope is that we're not having to use different terms all the time and have different perspectives necessarily. We're kind of able to come together and realize the importance of this kind of work. Here's an organizing framework for getting you thinking about some of the ways in which human dimensions can have an impact in natural resource or wildlife management. What I like about this is at the bottom, it's showing these different disciplinary foundations, recognizing that human dimensions is not just one social science, but it can draw from the multiple social science disciplines. A lot of times you hear people using human dimensions and sociology, for example, synonymously, but we have to recognize that sociology is just one social science discipline with one particular perspective. So this is showing that we can draw from all of these areas depending on what our research questions or our focus is. And then human dimensions can have some direct applications to management, and that would be through understanding the social context in which we're operating and making decisions in management. Also, understanding audiences can be a direct application, so understanding who we're communicating with, who we're working with in the public. But then there are also some functional applications here that human dimensions can inform that then ultimately inform management at the top. So things like stakeholder engagement, collaborative conservation, strategic communication efforts, and behavior change would all be part of that. So again, it's just a general framework for thinking about the different facets or the different functions of the human dimensions field in the management context. Here's some important considerations in human dimensions research for thinking about the application. First of all, the research needs to have theory, scientific rigor, and management relevance. So this is something that we preach time and again at CSU in terms of what are the different elements of human dimensions as a scientific field. And I think this gets at some of the misperceptions that are out there. A lot of times people are thinking that theory is just something that happens in the academic sort of ivory tower setting. But we argue that by drawing upon theory in the social sciences, we can actually have greater practical utility because we're not reinventing the wheel. We're working with frameworks that we know play an important role in understanding human thought and behavior. And I'll show you an example of that here in just a minute. And then, of course, managerial relevance is absolutely critical. As I said at the outset, we want to have an impact, and so we have to be very applied in the work that we do to make a difference. And then this is another one that I think is important for trying to set aside any misperceptions that might be out there about the role of human dimensions information. And that is, human dimensions is not intended to make the decision, but to inform it. So we have to remember that biology, the things that Sharon was talking about, these are also things that we need to consider. So just if we are determining what the public wants, that's not to say that that should be exactly what we do. A lot of times we might be making a decision in management that's different from what the public wants, and then human dimensions can help us better understand where we can target our communication efforts to alleviate potential controversy. And then human dimensions is needed at each stage of the decision-making process. So a lot of times I think what you see happening is human dimensions kind of comes in at the tail end after a decision has already been made, but yet it can be so helpful on the front end to help you understand your public, understand your audiences, and understand the root of the problem. And then finally, context and scale are key. So we need to be thinking about at what scale we're operating and what context we're doing our research. So I mentioned in the previous slide the importance of theory, and this is just one example I wanted to share with you in thinking about the role of human dimensions information and the importance of theoretical frameworks. This is called the value, attitude, behavior hierarchy, or cognitive hierarchy. It's a framework that we used oftentimes that comes from social psychology, and it shows that within the individual, there's a series of different types of cognitions that can affect or influence our behavior. And a lot of times with this research, we're interested ultimately in understanding behavior, human behavior, and what's at the root of that. So this framework helps us do that. And what's important to acknowledge here is that it makes a distinction between concepts like values and attitudes. A lot of times in the literature, we see values and attitudes getting used synonymously, but they have different implications for conservation. Values are formed very early on in life. They're formed in youth. So a lot of times in psychology, they talk about values being formed by about the age of 12. These are very enduring beliefs that are, influenced heavily by your upbringing and your socialization experiences. Attitudes, on the other hand, are a little more transient. They're a little more context specific, okay? And they're directed toward a particular issue. So I might have a particular attitude toward coyotes or an attitude toward a coyote management strategy. That's different from my fundamental values that may be at the root of that, but are much more basic, because the values are about how we want the world to be. Attitudes are more directed at specific issues or objects. So the reason why those distinctions are so important from a management standpoint is that values are something that we can't readily influence. We can work with kids to try to make a difference in terms of building natural resource stewardship values, but attitudes, on the other hand, are something that we can more readily influence through communication efforts. So that's why those distinctions become so important. On the one hand, we can affect something, and on the other hand, we can't play much of a role in doing that. So just as a quick example to maybe make this a little more tangible for you, I'm going to share with you a couple of findings from some of our research that speak to these different distinctions like values and attitudes and how that can help us better understand human behavior. So Mike Manfredo and I at Colorado State have been involved in some long-term research for the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, looking at public values toward wildlife and how they're changing in the Western United States. And this is sort of a simplification of the model that we're using in thinking about people's values toward wildlife. You can think about it as a spectrum, almost like a continuum. On the one hand, you have people who have more of a utilitarian value orientation toward wildlife, and on the other end of the spectrum, what we're referring to more is this mutualism view of the wildlife resource. So utilitarians are going to tend to believe that wildlife should be used and managed primarily for human benefit, and they tend to be more accepting of practices like hunting and believe that there should be an abundance of wildlife for those kinds of activities. And then on the other hand, you have mutualists who are much more focused on a relationship of caring with wildlife, almost viewing wildlife as if they're potential companions or part of the family. And there's this notion of wildlife having rights like humans that goes along with that as well. And what we're seeing with our research is that with modernization, so with our society changing, with urbanization and a rise in income and education and so on, there's this gradual shift that's happening from utilitarianism to mutualism in terms of how people relate to wildlife. Here's just one example of the findings from the first phase of our research, and we're getting ready to replicate this here in the next couple of years. And this is looking at the distribution of those that would have more of a utilitarian orientation toward wildlife across the 19 western states that participated in the research. And I know you can't see the numbers very well, so if you look at the color shading, the higher the darker the color shade, the higher the percentage of people in a state with that perspective toward wildlife. So we see the highest percentages in the Rocky Mountains and Plains states, with the highest being in Alaska and South Dakota at 50%. Lower percentages along the coast, the lowest in Hawaii at 25%. And Colorado, you see there 34%, a little bit on the lower end, but sort of in the middle in terms of where that falls out. And then as another example of the findings, this is looking at the relationship at the state level between the percent of people in a state that have a mutualism value orientation toward wildlife and the percent of people residing in the more urban centers in the state. And so this is, talking about how there might be this link between modernization factors like urbanization and this shift more toward mutualism, away from utilitarianism. So we see states like Colorado, California, Washington, higher percentages of people residing in urban areas and higher percentages of people with more of a mutualism value orientation toward wildlife. And while these are cross-sectional data, meaning that they're not longitudinal, it's just one snapshot in time, it is suggesting that there's a pattern here that would be consistent with what we'd expect if urbanization is one of the contributing factors to this shift away from mutualism. Now, in thinking about the management implications of this, we know that wildlife value orientations tend to have an important impact on people's wildlife-related behaviors. And so this is one example of that, looking at how people with different value orientations have different rates of participation in wildlife-related recreation. And so you see, for example, those who are more utilitarian are going to be more likely to participate in hunting and fishing activities, and then the mutualists are going to be more likely to participate in wildlife viewing. Now, what I didn't mention in the definitions earlier is that we've identified a group that we're terming the pluralists, and this is a group that tends to have both a mutualism value orientation toward wildlife and also a utilitarian value orientation. And that seems a little confusing, but what ends up happening is that for some issues, the pluralists are going to behave more like mutualists in terms of their reactions, and then for other issues, they'll behave more like utilitarians. And so interestingly, you see the pluralists are relatively high across all of those activities. And then the distanced group, which is a group that doesn't have a very well-formed value orientation toward wildlife, is lower across all of those. So here's another quick example, and this is showing the relationship between wildlife value orientations and attitudes or reactions to wildlife management strategies. And this is in the context of a human-wildlife conflict scenario that we see a lot of times here in Colorado in certain times of the year, where you have bears coming into residential areas and involved in a nuisance type situation. So in this case, getting into trash and pet food containers. So on the survey that we conducted for this larger wildlife values project, we asked people about their reactions to different population level control strategies that you see here on the x-axis for dealing with this situation. And what we find overall is that the utilitarians and pluralists are more accepting when we start to talk about something that's more lethal in nature, in this case recreational hunting or controlled agency hunts. And then mutualists and distanced are much less accepting of that. There's more consensus when we talk about doing nothing. Most groups are saying that that is an unacceptable way to respond to this. But we see a clear division when we start to look at some of those lethal management strategies, showing that the value orientations form the foundation for conflict over these wildlife issues. And also by understanding the wildlife value orientations, it can help us sort of anticipate how people might respond across a host of these strategies. So to conclude this, I just want to talk a little bit about what we envision some of the important future directions for human dimensions are. A lot of the research that gets conducted in this field is involving these broad-based surveys, like what I just described, where you'll collect data at a national level or a state level or perhaps a regional level. But what becomes more useful is if we're able to look at things like attitudes, values, behaviors at finer degrees of resolution, realizing that a lot of times the decisions that are being made from a management standpoint and also the education programs that are being initiated from a management standpoint, those are going to be happening at more local levels. So having the human dimensions information at those local levels means that it's going to be able to play more of a role in informing those management decisions and education strategies. And also in the human-wildlife conflict context, having more local information can allow us to more readily combine it with biological data or ecological data so that we can start to pinpoint hotspots for conflict that are not just about the sort of direct consequences and the biology of it, but also that take into account this human-human conflict that I was talking about at the outset, some of the social conflicts that have arisen. So just as one quick example of that to hopefully provide something more tangible, we conducted some work a few years ago for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife on the topic of wolf management. As some of you may know, in Washington state, over the last several years, wolves have been naturally moving in from other surrounding areas, including Canada, and this natural recolonization is starting to occur in Washington, particularly in the northeastern corner of the state. And so as part of the survey effort that we were working on for them, they wanted to identify how people were thinking about some of these wolf-related issues, how people were feeling about wolves and also wolf management strategies to provide input to their management plan that they were working on. So anyway, overall in the survey, this is just one item as an example of what we looked at. We found that 74% of people who responded to the survey, this is statewide, were accepting of the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife moving wolves from one area of the state where they've reestablished to other locations to help with the overall recolonization. And again, this was just one management strategy that was being considered. So overall, accepting of that. Now, if we look at more local levels, and in this study we were able to do that because we collected data at the county level, we find a divergence of opinion on that management issue. So while 74% of people statewide were accepting of that, we have well under 50% in many of the counties, including in areas where the natural recolonization has started to occur. And this has played out on the ground with some pretty serious controversy. In fact, the agency not too long ago removed a wolf pack in the northeastern corner of the state because of conflict with livestock. So we're seeing the social context that you see depicted here actually play out in the form of people having lower tolerance for wolves and wolves coming in that northeast corner. So if the agency were to only rely on the state level findings, they wouldn't be able to take into account that low level of tolerance that we see in many of the counties throughout the state, which is where oftentimes some of these management decisions are getting made. So I think it shows the utility of collecting these data at finer degrees of resolution. So to just conclude, these are just a couple of summary points that highlight some of the uses of information. So it can help us with understanding and representation of diverse publics. We can understand their values, their attitudes toward management issues, and ultimately what forms the basis for their behaviors. It can help us anticipate how people will respond to management issues and strategies, and that can be through surveys that collect data on wildlife values that allow us to anticipate responses across a host of issues, or it could be surveys that actually collect attitudinal data, so how people are responding to specific management issues and strategies. It can help explore the foundation for social conflict, realizing where different groups are coming from and why conflict is occurring, and that can inform communication strategies aimed at conflict mitigation, which leads into the next point about assistance with communication and education programs. And then finally, just visioning and planning for the future. So thinking about what the public is looking like now in your community or in your state or in your region, and then how it might be changing, can help us anticipate some of the social conflicts that we might experience, but also some of the opportunities that might be there for coming up with solutions to these problems in the future. So with that, I'm actually going to turn it over to Andrew, who's going to talk, as I said, about some of the more specifics of the human dimensions component of the Coyote project, now that I've given you sort of a baseline overview of the field.